Chapter 2. The sun was low over the Glenfinnan hills, filling the valleys with long shadows and dark lanes of purple. An eagle wheeled in tight circles above a tall pinnacle of rock, a stack on which MacLeod guessed it kept its eyrie. The clansman breathed the sweet scent of the heather, drawing it deeply into his lungs, and wondered how such perfect scenery could have so many faces. He turned to his two companions, his cousins, Dougal MacLeod and Angus MacLeod, but their eyes were not on the eagle. They were studying the rocks ahead of them, and Connor could feel the tenseness in the air. In that year of 1536, Connor MacLeod and his clan had decided to settle their differences with the Frasers. His cousins were ever watchful for the ambush, which might come at any time on their ride back to their village. All three men were riding bareback, and their thick Celtic legs gripped the sides of the sturdy mounts, gently applying pressure to maintain direction. Each of them carried his claymore and tard in the right hand, while the left loosely held the reins. "We'll be back before nightfall," said Angus in a satisfied tone. "I mind I said it would be so." His beard glistened with drops of sweat, which ran down from his cheeks into the matted tangle of hair. Dougal said, "You're never wrong, Angus. That's one thing we can never accuse you of, being wrong." Dougal's face was staring away from Angus at the time, and the older man strained in his saddle to attempt to look at the other's expression. He was never sure whether he was being made a fool of or not. Dougal turned to him now with a face full of seriousness, though a muscle was twitching in the corner of his mouth. Connor, who knew full well that Dougal was being sarcastic, smiled at the irony of his cousin, careful not to let Angus see. His kinsmen were not above fighting him and amongst themselves, even though the Frasers might descend upon them at any time. The maxim of the MacLeods might be, "I am against my cousin, but my cousin and I are against the stranger." They were a warlike people, by necessity, having to guard their crofts and huts against marauders from all sides of the Scottish hills. Suddenly, Connor's mount shied slightly. Angus had already paused, his huge nose sniffing at the air. "What is it?" said Dougal. "If I knew, I wouldn't be worried," said Angus. "I'm not afeard of things that I can see." Beyond the rocks were some pines, a clump not much bigger than a spinney, but large enough to hide several men, if they were disposed to wait in ambush. Connor's horse was doing a sidestep now, clearly feeling its rider's agitation. The sun had been sliced in two by a flat-topped peak, and the light was beginning to fade rapidly. Connor listened hard, but all he could hear was the gargling of the burn as it struggled to find a downward path through the peat. "The trees." Angus sniffed again. He maintained he could smell a Fraser from a quarter of a mile away, but Connor suspected that it was because the older man was going a little deaf that he trusted to this sense when his sight would not tell him what was going on. "Well, man, we canna stay here all night," said Dougal. At that moment, they came, not out of the trees, but from the rocks above. There were 5 of them, all wearing the Fraser tartan, and even the hard-of-hearing Angus must have been deafened by their yells. "Right again, Angus!" cried Dougal. Though whether he was talking about the fact that the enemy were present, or whether he was being sarcastic again and referring to the pines, no one stopped to ask. The claymores were out, catching the last rays of the sun on their blades. Connor held his tard low to protect his thigh and the horse's flank, since the Frasers were on foot. One of them, a red-bearded man with wild eyes, came pounding over the turf to slash at the horse's head. Connor turned his mount. He brought down the claymore in a wide sweep at the Fraser's head. But the clansman was too quick for him, bringing up his own blade to block the blow. Both men were jarred to the teeth from the clash of weaponry. Connor's horse sidestepped then, onto the Fraser's foot, and the man yelled, striking its head with the boss of his tard. With the Fraser's shield arm thus occupied, Connor thrust with the point of his sword. The blade entered the man's cheek, just below the bone. It was not a death blow, but the other, his foot free now, ran backwards. Connor could see him sticking his tongue through the new hole in his face. An axe hit Connor's shoulder, but the blade was almost flat on impact because the wielder had to stand on tiptoe. Connor recognized the attacker as Ian Fraser, a youngster not more than 15 years of age. Connor backed his mount into the lad, sending him sprawling onto the heather. "Away, and home to your mother," yelled Connor, "before I have to split your ears." "Boys," cried Dougal, "just wee laddies." One of them lay dead on the turf, half draped over a rock. The others had scattered now, all except the man that had first attacked Connor. He began scrambling up the escarpment, but Angus was quick to follow, dismounting and chasing him on foot. The Fraser turned to face him on the slope, and blades clashed, metal biting metal. The Fraser's bonnet came off, revealing a bald head that shone in the gloaming. Angus kicked him high on the leg, and the other went over. The MacLeod's sword came down, point first, and pinned the writhing Fraser to the hillside. There was a brief yell from the victim, a spurt of blood from his mouth. Then the evening was quiet once more. Angus came down, wiping his blade on his kilt. "What was the man thinking of?" he grumbled. "Bringing youngsters of that age." Dougal said, "If they're old enough to lift a weapon, they're old enough to fight." Connor said nothing. He was leaning over from his horse, looking at the young man sprawled over the rock. The darkness had descended now, like a black shroud. He was thinking about a pig they had slaughtered a few days back, and how the eyes of the animal had been wide with stark terror as the spear went into its throat. The lad's eyes were like that of the pig's, wide and full of the horror of death. He was saddened by the youth that had been spilled like water on the heather. "Did you have to cut his throat, Dougal? Could you not have stunned him?" Dougal sounded incensed, but Connor guessed this was partly defensive. "He was coming at me, man. I didn't stop to question his age. The laddie had a claymore, and that was what I kept my eyes on, not his face. It's no my fault, it's his." He pointed with his own sword at the body lying on the side of the hill. Connor rubbed his shoulder where the battle axe had struck him. It had not even broken the cloth, but still there would be a bruise the size of Angus's fist there in the morning. Angus was collecting the weapons dropped by the Frasers when they had fled. They would be useful in the coming battle, There was a certain amount of satisfying irony in killing a Fraser with one of his own clan's weapons. The three men then continued their journey over the low hills until the lights of the village came into view. Sentries called out to them as they approached, an edge to the voice which revealed a nervous tension. There was the smell of boiled vegetables in the air, underlined with the odour of cooked meat. Connor's stomach began to respond to the stimulants, churning over. He had not eaten since the early morning. At their approach, a figure came out of one of the peat and stone crofts, standing in the light of the dim candles within. As Connor and his companions passed the bonfire in the middle of the village, she came running towards them, crying, "Connor!" Dougal said, "Somebody's pleased to see somebody." "I'll thank you to keep your thoughts to yourself, Cousin Dougal," said Connor. But he was pleased to be greeted in such a fashion. Kate caught hold of his rein as she arrived breathless by the horse's side. He looked down on her and smiled. Her thin face broke into an impish grin. "Did you bring me a present, Connor MacLeod?" "We've been out gathering recruits, woman. No on a spree," Angus said testily, replying for him. "I brought you myself, Kate MacLeod. Is that no good enough?" She pouted. "It'll have to do, won't it?"